Yeah, I thought the thing that's sort of snagging at my mind is what she said a little later on in the interview, which was about just basically holding people's attention, and that we're in this kind of period of history, let's call it, where there's so many distractions, aren't there? And as a historical long form novelist, you're demanding quite a lot of someone to stay with you for however many 300-400 pages, and I think that in itself is quite a challenge to be pushing back against, compared to, say, 100 years ago, where all anyone had was interesting literature. I mean, that's to simplify, but do you know what I mean? Like, do you feel that rub at all in terms of your own approach to writing?
I think so. I think there's definitely that balance, and she addressed it when she was talking to us. That balance between the historical accuracy and all the things that we really focus on getting right, and also telling a really good story that people are interested in and bringing people along. I liked her story about sort of needing to tempt her undergraduate students into an European literature class by dropping a tidbit in, and she called it historical tea. So all the gossip and all of the exciting, interesting things that can come up. I really liked what she had to say about that, and I also really liked the responsibility that she seems to have for bringing things into more awareness in terms of the historical record, in particular with the stories that she's telling about Black women in the United States. There's a real sense of, if these stories don't get told, people won't know that they're interested, and they won't connect with things, and the scholarly work won't be done. And there is a real sense of responsibility there. And I think that goes so much further than I can ever articulate when I'm talking about why I write about what I write. I often say these are stories of women that don't get told, but she has a real sense of purpose and a real sense of the why behind why she writes historical fiction. I think it's really inspiring.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it was interesting right from the beginning. She seemed to have this kind of long-term strategy. I mean, we didn't actually pin her down on it, but that was, I don't know whether you were picking that up as well. I was feeling like she kind of planned to write these historical romance series in order to then sort of zero in on some of the more important targets to her, as it were, like the life of Anne Lowe and presumably others that are coming down the line. And I thought that's quite, we've talked to some amazing authors in this series, really, in terms of their foresight, their passion, and their sort of, their commitment to their strategy. Like Octavia had a particular sort of mission statement in mind, didn't she, when we were talking last time with her, and sounds similarly with Piper. Another thing that I loved about was actually seeing her response when she was talking about was it Chevalier St. George, and you could sort of see that flicker of emotion on her, as to realize this man had been effectively erased from history, and in order to kind of bring him back, and the influence that could have, not only on her own ethnicity, black women, black people, but also I think that sense of telling stories about outside of the mainstream narrative is what familiarizes us with other people who are different to us, right? And so whether you're of that particular group and it means something more to you to finally see some representation, or you're of a different group who just that human connection of story is just going to kind of bring us all together, one would hope, rather than divide us all up again. So I thought that was quite inspiring, actually.
I love the there's a proper quote or study, I'm sure, that could sum this up better than I can. But I love the idea that fiction readers are inherently empathetic, because you have to be in somebody else's head. You have to be, going along with a character's journey throughout a book. And then you finish that book, and then you do it all over again with different people, different time periods, experiences that are different than your own. And I think there's something really wonderful about that in looking at historical fiction in particular, because, my experience as a woman living in 2023 is completely different than anything that I write about. And it's completely different than quite frankly, a lot of the books that I read about as well. And so I like that reminder of how historical fiction can really bring that empathy out in readers and make people realize that the world is just a lot bigger than what they're familiar with.
Yeah, it's such an opportunity, isn't it? And I always feel a bit sensitive when I'm trying to write female characters. Like, is this really, do I have, of course you have to, because your world has men and women, and you do the same with men in your books. It's like, what is it really like to be a woman? I can sort of imagine, and maybe one gets somewhat closer to the mark or further away, who, in a sense, your readers would be the judge of that. But it is a responsibility, isn't it? And she, when she was describing the detail of the resources that were available on the life of Anne Lowe, and then the connection with that family, I suddenly thought, oh wow, gosh, what if I had to do that for my own characters? I was like, and actually, what I intend to do with the next novel I'm going to try and write is seriously fictionalize a real character, almost. It's almost to the point of, this is not even purporting to be what he actually did. It's just a kind of literary device to play around with. But making me think he probably has some descendants who might take issue with how one represents him or other characters in this story. I don't know.
I think it's an interesting additional challenge writing about people who have not only descendants, but very active descendants. And it's interesting to me that Anne Lowe's great granddaughter reached out to her to Piper after the book came out. So long after the research project portion of the book was done. I do find that a little intimidating, I'm not going to lie. And I have a lot of admiration for people who do write biographical historical fiction, because it's always a risk. But then at the same time, you're telling these stories that aren't necessarily common knowledge. And so, highlighting Anne Lowe's work, highlighting, whoever, there's so many authors who are pulling on historical figures across the whole publishing world. I think there's something really admirable about that as well. I will admit I've been too scared to do it so far. So maybe one day.
Yeah, fortunately, my period is way, way, way in the deep, dark past. So far anyway.
Well, can I ask you a very, very unplanned question? You mentioned that she has this big strategy, and that she mentioned that writing biographical historical fiction is sort of phase 2. Have you got a strategy of sorts sort of underpinning your career? Because I'm not sure that I could point directly to being that intentional with my career.
I have had thoughts to strategy, but the challenges that I've met with is that even those strands of, I thought I could do, because basically I'm doing Dark Age historical epics. I thought I could have like an adult, continue that in that vein, doing adult fiction at the same time as doing a sort of Viking fantasy version of that with children's books.
Oh, cool.
And the idea of like writing a children's fantasy adventure plus an adult historical fiction a year. But so far it hasn't worked with it. I've written a children's fantasy book, but haven't got a publisher with that. So that's sort of on ice in a drawer. And then the series that I'm working on right now in terms of my current period of historical fiction is sort of, I'm getting the sense from the publisher that it might be running out of steam as a series, which is, in one sense, is disappointing, because you just want everything to go your way and all the lines go up. But at the same time, I think the reality is, you're going to reach these sort of narrow gates, as it were, that you've got to pass through in order to kind of keep earning your keep as an author. So I think, and actually this series has been inspiring to me, because it's thrown it back on me and gone, well, how much do you want this? If this strategy that seemed very obvious to you is not just there for the picking, either work harder in order to make it possible, or else, you're going to have to adapt and really go for in another direction at the same time, or with as much energy. So it didn't feel like before I even, started writing at all, that I had a kind of massive game plan of like, this is what I want to tell the world, in the same way that she did. But I think once you're in it, you do start formulating, like, I mean, you've done it a little bit with your historical mysteries, right? And from romance to historical fiction.
Yeah, I think some of it is, as you say, I don't know that I could have said to you when I first started writing that I knew exactly what the kinds of books I was going to write would be at different stages in my career. But I think you're right. You reach these pivot points in your career, and sometimes those pivot points are kind of thrust upon you, and sometimes you choose to pivot in your career, and you have to think, what is this going to do long term? What do I really want? And I think that helps you articulate what it is that is important, and put a strategy together around that. So I think you're absolutely right. And with regards to that, the reason I'm writing historical World War II mystery right now is because I want a different string to my bow, but I also want to be able to carry along readers who have read my historical World War II fiction books. And so, kind of straddling two genres that have a lot of commonality between them helps with that.
I think, as someone who listens to you and obviously has read a couple of your books now, I would say, if someone said to me, "What's Julia's thing?" I would say, well, she's you're telling lesser known stories about women. So it's sort of, there is a sort of theme there. And I suppose for me, the thing I keep coming back to is the opposition, the conflict, which I see as almost an eternal conflict between power on the one hand and love on the other. And sort of wrapped up in love is like self-sacrifice. And, basically it's kind of like the self-serving power versus sacrificial love. And like which doesn't mean it's all about romance. It's sort of slightly bigger renditions of that. But I think those are the kind of, if there's a message that seems to suffuse the stuff that I want to write, it's more at that level rather than like, oh, I must tell this person's story or this group of people's story, I think. So maybe it's a bit more metaphysical.
Well, I think, one of the great things about this series is there's just so much to learn from other authors, and it's exciting to see everybody's different approaches and how it makes us think about what it is that we do as authors, and hopefully the audience as well.
Thanks for watching this clip from the History Quill podcast, all about writing and publishing historical fiction. If you want to find out more about the topics discussed, check the description for a link to the full episode and the episode page on our website, where you can access a range of relevant resources. You can also join our email list to receive new podcast episodes and more content for historical fiction writers. And of course, don't forget to like, subscribe, and switch on notifications.